Shalom. We are in the fourth session dealing with the parable of the two olive trees in Romans chapter 11. We have spoken about this parable, and now I'm coming to some conclusions that are important for understanding of the Apostle Paul in general and for the whole plan of salvation that God has designed through Yeshua HaMashiach for the whole world. The passage in Romans chapter 11 verse 25 and 26 is oftentimes broadened and misunderstood because of what is called replacement theology in the history of Christian churches. Replacement theology essentially says that God is finished with the Jews and the church is now the elect people of God. God's anointed elect people is the church. And Israel is finished. This doctrine is, of course, one of the biggest plagues in Christianity and one of the biggest wrongs that has been wrought in the history of the Christian churches. Because every church thinks that they are the elect people, that the others are not. And essentially, this happened during the 4th, 5th century in the official church of the Byzantine Empire that later became the Catholic Church, and from it split the Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox Church, and from them came other churches, and finally the Protestants split from the Catholic Church, and then they kept splitting until there was thousands of Christian denominations, and each one thinks, okay, we are the Israel of God, and the Jews are nothing. God's finished with them, which is directly opposed to what the Apostle Paul says even in the first verses of chapter 11, when he asks the question, has God rejected his people whom he foreknew? The answer that the Apostle Paul gives is no. And then, in order to keep the Gentiles from boasting over the branches that were cut off, burned off, and fallen, the branches of Israel, some of the branches of Israel, not all the branches of Israel, because there's always a remnant that remains, and Paul makes that very clear in chapters 9, 10, and 11 of Romans. And of course, this is very clear also in the prophets. But we're talking now about all Israel. And the image that he takes is of an olive tree that was damaged, that branches were cut off from it. And Paul repeats this doctrine by saying that God is able to graft the fallen branches back in. And in fact, God promises to do so. Not only able to do so, he promises to do so when Paul says in verse 25 and 26 that he's going to reveal the mystery, that in the fullness of the time of the Gentiles, all Israel shall be saved. And as I've shown in the earlier lessons, all Israel's salvation is promised from the book of Genesis on through the whole Bible, through all the prophets. However, the root of this concept of the olive tree that comes back to life is found in Job chapter 14 verse 7, from where Paul gets this concept. I will read to you verse 7. For there is hope of a tree, if it be cut down, and it will sprout again, and that tender branch thereof will not cease, though the root thereof wax old in the earth, and the stock thereof die in the ground. Yet through the scent of water it will bud and bring forth boughs like a plant. Paul is talking here about men, and he uses a tree as an example. I can tell you my personal story that years ago when I was living in Ramat Denya in Jerusalem, there were dozens and dozens of olive trunks of olive trees that were thrown out in the empty field and left there for more than a year. They were dry, there were nothing green on them, there were very little roots left on them. And then the city came and dug holes, planted these looked like dead pieces of wood into the ground, and nothing happened for many months until the 1992 very heavy snow that fell over Jerusalem and covered Jerusalem for several days, freezing weather. Immediately after that, those olive trees started to bud Now the whole area is full of olive trees, full of olives. They're all giving fruit. And people come and pick the fruit and make olive oil and olives cured at home. Those olive trees, almost every single one of them, except one, came back to life, which is the reason that Paul uses the olive tree as the example. And the Gentiles that were taken off the wild olive tree, that normally doesn't bear very good fruit, are planted into the natural olive tree, which bears fruit. And they are planted together with Israel and the Jewish people, sucking life from the same roots. From the roots of Israel, from the roots of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, and Moses, and the prophets, that give life to the church. Without this, the church would be nothing more than another pagan religion that is disconnected from history and disconnected from God's promises and covenants. Therefore, dear brethren, when Paul says, when the fullness of the time of the Gentiles come, all Israel shall be saved, he's not bringing a new doctrine. He's bringing the same doctrine that was brought by Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, and the other prophets, that God is faithful to his promises. And that's why at the end of chapter 11, Paul goes into this ecstasy and says, the promises and the things that God has spoken are going to become true, and he becomes ecstatic in the end of chapter 11. We are dealing with one of the key issues that still plagues the Christian world, and that is their attitude toward Israel and their attitude toward the Jewish people. God's promise will be true, all Israel will be saved. The question whether the Gentiles are included or not included on Israel is really dependent on the Gentiles themselves, because God has only one body, one Savior, one baptism, one Spirit, and in God's economy, Israel is the chosen people of God. They are not rejected, and verse 28 of chapter 11 makes it very clear, even though according to the gospel they are hated, talking about Israel and the Jewish people, for your sake, for the sake of the Gentiles, according to God's election, they are beloved of God for the sake of the fathers. You must not forget this passage. You must, as Christians, reconsider the basic teaching about Israel that your churches teach, and reconnect with the root, reconnect with the history of salvation that God has wrought from Abraham on through Moses to King David and until Yeshua HaMashiach, who is still the King of the Jews. He was never the King of the Scots or the Irish or the Dutch or the Swedes. He was always the King of the Jews, remains the King of the Jews, and when he comes back, he will still be the King of the Jews. That's why your relationship to Israel needs to be reviewed. The fullness of the time of the Gentiles is now, because Jerusalem is reunited, and from Luke chapter 21, verse 24, we see that the deliverance of Jerusalem from the foot soldiers, the shoes of the foreign legions that have occupied Jerusalem over the centuries, that, dear brethren, is finished. We are now in the restoration of Israel and in the restoration of the church. I challenge you all to write us. We will try to answer you if we have a way of answering you. God bless you, and continue studying the Bible from its Jewish roots. Shalom.